the UK National Trust, and Yale University's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. We have an exciting program this afternoon, and to get things started, I would like to invite the Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, Ms. Alessandra Cummings, to share some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Natalie, and it's a special pleasure to see you all here today. Welcome, welcome. Good afternoon. It's with great enthusiasm that I welcome you to the Views of Bridgetown Symposium. This gathering marks a significant milestone in the collaborative research initiative between the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, the Yale Centre for British Art, the United Kingdom National Trust, and Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. The Views of Bridgetown project represents a pivotal effort to deepening our understanding of Barbados's artistic and historical heritage through the study of some of the earliest surviving panoramic representations of the island. These remarkable works, created during the British colonial period, hold invaluable insights into the social, cultural, and artistic survivals and narratives of our time. They are more than paintings. They are tangible links to the past, reminding us of our place in the global story of colonialism, trade, and cultural exchange. Today's symposium provides an opportunity to explore the intersections of art conservation, scientific research, and historical inquiry. It's a privilege to have such a distinguished panel of experts with us, including Ms. Kendall Francis, Dr. Annika Bezur, Dr. Richard Hark, and our very own Anne Bancroft. Their presentations will illuminate the innovative approaches being used to unlock the stories held within these paintings, from technical imaging and pigment analysis to the broader implications for conservation practices in the Caribbean and beyond. So for the students among us, this means you. I'm particularly excited about the interactive demonstrations later today, which will provide a hands-on look at how cutting-edge scientific techniques are transforming the way we study and preserve our cultural heritage. This is a perfect example of how collaborations like this can enrich our understanding of the past while fostering a stronger foundation for future conservation efforts. As we embark on this journey of discovery together, I want to express my gratitude to our project partners and to all of you who are joining us today, either in present or online. Your presence underscores the importance of these conversations and the shared responsibility we hold to preserve and celebrate our heritage. So thank you, and I hope you all enjoy this afternoon's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. So as seen on your program, the format of this symposium will be 2 sessions of 2 presentations each, with a Q&A portion at the end of each session. This will be followed by a break, after which there will be a demonstration, not in this room, but up in our Cunard Gallery, and we'll be able to guide you to that space in the break. So our first presentation is titled Insights into Painting Conservation by Ms. Kendall Francis. Kendall Francis is the Assistant Paintings Conservator at the Yale Centre for British Art. Kendall received a BA Joint Honours degree in Fine Art and Art History from Plymouth University and a PGDIP in Easel Painting Conservation from the Courtauld Institute of Art. She has held positions as a Conservation Fellow at the National Gallery London, a freelance painting conservator, and most recently, a painting conservation intern at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Her research includes technical studies into William van de Velde the Younger, Anthony van Dyck, Joaquin Sorolla, and her long-term personal project tracing the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation in artist materials. Kendall is enthusiastic about advancing accessibility, diversity, and inclusion in art heritage for disadvantaged young people and Black and ethnic minorities. Please join me in welcoming Kendall.
So I just want to say a big thank you to the Barbados Museum Historical Society for hosting this event, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. So as introduced, my name is Kendall Francis. I'm a paintings conservator. I'm originally from London, UK, but I now work at the Yale Centre for British Art. Do I need to hold that?
Or just rest it.
Okay. Yeah, so now I live in America, in the United States. So today I wanted to share some insights into the world of painting conservation with you. It's a multidisciplinary field that combines science, art and history to preserve and protect our cultural heritage. And so I'll begin this talk briefly by explaining kind of my personal journey into painting conservation and how I found it, because it is a bit of a niche field, and the steps I kind of took to study it for those students in the audience. And then I'll also highlight a few pathways for you to kind of like explore, and then I'll share what the actual role of a paintings conservator is, like the day-to-day and what I get up to, and then I will wrap up with some interesting research into colonial legacies in artist materials. So my journey into conservation began when I was in school. I loved art. I was always in the art room at school, just copying paintings that I was seeing in books, and always during lunch and after school, just sitting there, painting and drawing. My love was kind of Renaissance art. There was a really cool Renaissance book that I always copied. And so I didn't know conservation existed, but I was very lucky and privileged to have an amazing head teacher who saw me in the art room and whose husband is a conservator and introduced me to conservation as a career. So I then decided to go on and study fine art and art history at university. Those of my peers that went and studied conservation, you don't have to do a joint degree. You can solely come from fine art or science, from a chemistry background, or art history, but I decided to do both. And so then after that, I applied and got into a 3-year postgraduate course studying easel painting conservation at the Courtauld Institute of Art. And so, as I said, to study kind of conservation, you need the 3 essential skills. You need kind of the artistic ability, you need the knowledge of art history and the context of how these objects and why these objects were made, and then you need a good understanding of chemistry. And so I don't call myself a scientist. I don't think I am still very good at science. So I didn't study science for like 7 years before I studied conservation at the Courtauld, where you kind of have that massive chemistry aspect. So if that is worrying you to study it, don't, because here I am. So the Courtauld is one of kind of 3 institutions that you can study painting conservation at, but there are 10 other institutions in the UK that offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in conservation. And I just wanted to, for those that are thinking about it, I wanted to draw your attention to the Institute of Conservation Icon, which is in the UK, and it has a really great web page about how to study conservation in the UK and all like the scholarships and things. So that is a good resource. And then the kind of there are a lot of other courses in the US. I have to say they are a bit more rigorous and complicated to get into than the UK. I know this is being recorded, so I'll just leave it there. So you need kind of a number of hours of pre-program experience before even studying, and you need credits, like university credits in science and studio crafts and things. So A great online resource again for understanding that process is the AIC, the American Institute for Conservation. But I also think a great way of kind of understanding this is to kind of just email, like find a conservator, email. We're all normally really helpful and nice, most of us. Actually, before attending the Courtauld, I did get into another well-known conservation program in the UK, but I couldn't afford it at the time. And so being very candid with you, studying conservation is quite expensive, and that can feel quite unreachable for many people, and it did for me at that point. And I think that was kind of like the first kind of inaccessible barrier that I experienced that did make me feel like this profession and this field didn't want me. So I come from a single parent family. My mum is amazing. Mum, if you're watching. And I've had to support myself financially since the age of 16. So it's quite intimidating, the financial aspect of studying conservation. So I think that is a really important reason why we're having these conversations. It is improving slowly, but I think we do still need to break these barriers down. And I had to apply to many scholarships to be able to afford to study and to cover tuition and everything. And so it is doable, and I wanted to kind of emphasize that if anyone here does and is thinking about studying conservation, my email is on this slide. Don't hesitate to contact me. This is the support that I was very privileged to have from my head teacher and her husband, who helped me get into this field. And I think that a lot of this stuff we have to pay forward and just help each other. So yeah, I'm happy to support however you need. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. Whilst after the Courtauld, I did lots of internships. As you heard, I had a fellowship at the National Gallery in London. I've had an internship at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and in lots of places across the UK and Europe. And that's one thing I love about this profession, is the ability to travel. I'd never been on a plane before until I went to university, and I've been able to see really great things, and it's even better to connect with so many different types of people from different backgrounds, and it is just one of the most incredible professions that brings so many different people together and so many cultures and histories and things. So yeah, if I haven't persuaded you now to study it, maybe I never will. So what is painting conservation? The work of a conservator is very rewarding in a career in heritage. The ability to work hands-on on paintings and study and preserve them for our communities is just very fulfilling. There isn't just painting conservation, there's conservation in so many other areas like paper, textiles, objects, wall paintings. I just have a bias for paintings, and as I mentioned before, we have the fine art history and science combinations, which kind of turn us into these detectives. We use the art historical research to place the context of the painting in the time period. We use the scientific and technical analysis techniques to reveal details about the artist's materials and techniques, and this information then helps us to preserve the artwork and understand its condition and the kind of best treatment aspects for it. And so I will kind of run through this and show you this process through an example of painting that I recently worked at the YCBA. That's the Yale Centre for British Art. You'll be hearing YCBA a lot. And this is the actual painting that, So I'll start with the historical context, but this is the actual painting that has brought us here. This is the painting, The Island of Barbados. It is attributed to Isaac Sailmaker, and it is in the collection of the YCBA, and it's dated around 1694, and it is what we believe is the earliest known painted representation of Barbados that we know of. And so it shows the kind of British colonial rule on the island very early on. It has the ship showing the kind of trade coming in and out, and it has I'll show you details, but actually on the island it shows the kind of sugarcane fields, and that depicts enslaved indigenous and African people working in various stages of the sugar production. And it kind of serves as quite a significant visual record for the kind of enslavement that was happening on the island, and the British colonial rule, and so it's quite an odd painting. It's a topographical view, and it's like a bird's eye view of the island. And so obviously back in the 17th century, no one could get that high. And we don't actually think the artist went to Barbados. So what was he basing it on? We think that he based it on this map. You probably all know it very well. It is the map by Richard Ligon, which was first published in 1657 alongside his book, The True and Exact History of the Island of Barbados. And so we think that the artist, based the topographical view of the island on this map. And so you can see that on the map and in the book, there are some real similar kind of imagery going on. You have the sea monster in the corner, or dolphin or whale, still undecided. We have donkeys scattered across the island. We have this exact same palm tree that Richard Ligon drew in the book. And also, we have lots of tiny little figures dotted around. So in the book, Richard Ligon describes all the diverse characters that are on the island at the time, and we see them in the painting. So we have the white owners, and they are quite identifiable by their hats, their kind of white breeches, like the socks that are pulled up, and those kind of waistcoats. We have two identifiable women that are on the ship, white women. And then we also have what we believe are the indentured servants that are working on the docks, bringing stuff in from the ships. We also have what we believe are the indigenous and native people from around the Caribbean and South and North America. The Native Americans were taken from the east coast of the USA and sent to Barbados. So there's lots of different kinds of people on the island, and obviously the indigenous and native people were integral to the British survival on the island, because they wouldn't have known what to grow or what to eat, and all would have just perished. And then we have representations of the enslaved African people. And so these people are actually showed doing the hard labor. So you can see here that they are carrying those massive sacks. They're rowing the white owners, and they're pounding the sugar. So one noticeable thing that you will see about a lot of these figures. So these are pictures that I have taken after treatment, but before I treated the painting, the way that the artist has painted those figures, he's put a brown paint down and first to kind of block in the shape of the figures, and then he went in to put like the clothes on, or if they were a white person would like put like more blobs of color on. But for a lot of the enslaved African and black people, he just left them at that kind of brown paint layer. And now from past treatments that have involved quite harsh chemical cleaning and rubbing, a lot of these brown and black figures have actually been rubbed away. So as I was going across the painting, I saw lots of kind of remnants of these figures, a leg, a blob, anything. So it was my, after treatment, I made sure to reinforce these figures where I could. You can see that I kind of reinforced the legs and everything on that figure, but the figure on the right is quite interesting. You can see that he is smoking out of no head. They had rubbed his head off. So this is where the historical context of understanding our paintings is really important. He is actually sitting here in the bottom left corner, watching all the other enslaved African people pound the sugar. And I thought to myself, like, why would an enslaved person be sitting there having a cigarette break whilst all the other enslaved people are doing the hard labor? So I was thinking that it could possibly be a white person's head that needs to go back there. But after doing kind of lots of research in understanding the way that the plantations were run, reading contemporary kind of 17th century manuals on how to run sugar plantations, I found that they did in fact put black overseers in place, and from really great articles that have been written from the anthropological articles from the Newton burial site, I also read that a lot of the enslaved people had really kind of bad teeth because of the amount of tobacco they were smoking as well. So just kind of putting those two things together and understanding that enslaved black people were smoking and overseers, I decided to kind of put a black person's head back there, which I think is a very small kind of minute detail to the painting, but I think shows the importance that some of these small details make to our understanding of our artworks. So, after understanding our historical context, we aid our understanding of both the condition of the painting and about the artist's materials through scientific analysis. And so they kind of all meld into one, and I'll take you through how those all work. So, a painting is a three-dimensional object. When you see it on the wall, you kind of just see that kind of flat picture. It's not, it's on something. So we kind of start with our support, which is the canvas or a wooden panel. And then we move up to the ground layers, and the ground layers means the priming layers that is put on the canvas or the panel. And then we move up to the paint layers. And so after that is the surface coatings. And those surface coatings means like the varnish and the dirt that is just like built up on the painting. So starting from the support, we use a thing called, we X-ray our paintings. So here is an X-ray of our painting, the island of Barbados. You can see that from this image there, you can see the weave pattern, and you can also see the damages. So if you kind of look in these areas, the dark patches are actually holes in the canvas. So it shows us that the original canvas has quite a lot of damage and loss. But in a detailed image, you can also see that running along here, it's actually two pieces of canvas that have been sewn together. And so this was quite common in the 17th century. It doesn't really, like now we can't fathom it, but canvas and fabric was really expensive, and the looms that it came on were quite thin. So to get larger size canvases, they were just impossible. It was just so expensive for artists to get that. So they would sew pieces of canvas together to create really kind of like large paintings. So the X-ray tells us all about the canvas, the condition, the weave pattern, and just basically how the support is. And then next we look at the ground layers, and we can look at those through a thing called infrared imaging. And I just want to say here, I apologize if any of my spelling is wrong. I'm not the best speller, so just ignore those. Sorry, infrared imaging. It's infrared imaging. I'm just going to read it because I'm really bad at explaining things like this. So it passes through the paint layers until it reaches something that it absorbs or reflects back to the camera. So at this kind of priming level, artists usually draw their designs of what they're going to paint. They're not. And that is what we call the underdrawing. So on top of the priming, they're kind of putting their underdrawing and their design on. And this is usually done with charcoal or kind of later on like a graphite. And both of like charcoal and graphite contains carbon, which absorbs infrared. So that kind of, it makes it visible in the imaging. So unfortunately our example of Barbados really isn't helpful here. So I just wanted to show you a picture of a 17th century painting of an unknown lady, but you can see that we have used infrared imaging on the painting, and we've done her face. And you can see that we can see the artist's drawings. So he's moved the lips a couple times, and he's just put some like indicators of where he needs to put the face and the shadow of the nose. So that imaging allows us to kind of look under those paint layers and see the artist's preparation drawing. And then, so after we understand the ground and priming layers, we move on to our paint layers. And now we do this with one way is through microscopic analysis. That it's always incredibly helpful to use the microscope. And you can see here I have taken 2 images with the microscope on the right-hand side, and that is a red part of the painting. Oh, I should have put where I took it from. But it's from a flag, a red flag, and then the blue part is from the sea. And the microscope kind of zooms all the way down so you can see those pigment particles in the paint layer. And so you can see that, and from those kind of the way the pigment particles are shaped, the way they kind of look and their color, we can indicate what pigment has been used. So from the top red one, we've got those tiny little like really kind of deep red particles, and that indicates that it could be vermilion. And then in the blue one, we have that real big kind of glassy blue particle, and that could indicate a pigment called smalt. Now, it just kind of gives us an indication. We can't confirm this. So to understand it even more, we take a thing called a cross-section. And now cross-sections for me were really hard to understand at the beginning. Oh my God. Cross-sections are basically taking a cutting of a painting, and it shows the layers of the painting, and you can kind of see here the actual size of them. They're the size of like a pinprick. They're absolutely tiny. So we set them and we put them under the microscope, and we see this. And you can see that these are the 2 ground priming layers, and this is the paint layer. And we can see that big glassy blue particle again. And we pass these off to the conservation scientists, who then do an incredible analytical tool on it, which basically throws X-rays into like these areas, which gives us information on what the elements are present, and then that can tell us what the pigment actually is. And I'm just going to skip over this one because my colleagues will be talking about that. So lastly, we can examine the paint layers, the surface coatings, and we do that with ultraviolet light and just with our eyes and normal light. And so the painting before treatment was a bit yellowish, and that was because there was a degraded varnish layer on, and you can see that in UV this varnish layer fluoresces, and you can see it's fluorescing very kind of yellowish green, and the kind of varnish layers fluoresce differently, and that can tell us what type of varnish it is and how to take it off basically. You can also see in UV that there's these really dark areas, and they are old retouchings by previous restorers who have gone in past treatments. And in normal light, you can even see that these retouchings that past conservators have done are not matching the painting anymore. So they all need to come off. And that is what I do next, the conservation treatment. So I remove this discoloured varnish layer. Actually, I first clean the painting, and we clean paintings that have varnish layers with saliva first. There's so much like dirt and things that build up. I'm really bad at cleaning my house, but every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, there's like so much dust that builds up, and that over centuries of time on paintings can really build up. And one of the best cleaners is our saliva, because it's thick, it's warm, it's got enzymes, and its pH is slightly off. So we use our saliva to clean this dirt off the paintings, and then we can remove the varnish with solvents. And you can see that this is a halfway during cleaning. So you can see the kind of colour difference. The original painting was so much more cooler, and the tonality is so much nicer, and that varnish layer was just completely changing the kind of reading of the painting. So that was removed. And this is kind of halfway through cleaning, but you can't really see it. And then the next stage, but also these are kind of losses to the paint layers, these brown holes. So the next stage is to fill those holes, because when I have to retouch those losses back in, it has to be the same surface and the same texture. And so I'm in a dark room, I've got that rake in light, and I've got to fill all those losses with that same texture. So you can see that there's that kind of brush stroke that I've continued through, that I've had to replicate. And so after I've filled all the losses, this is what the painting kind of looks like. You can see these are all the losses that I filled, and this is after cleaning. There's a lot of abrasion, everything. And I have to then retouch the painting. And so I retouch the painting with contemporary conservation colours. Everything we kind of use in conservation is hopefully reversible, but we know how they age, we know how to take them off, and we know they're not harming the painting. So everything's kind of modern synthetic materials, but we do also use like pigments that the artist was using, but obviously we can't use lead white or a pigment called vermilion, which is a mercury sulfide, and both those words sound scary, so we can't use that anymore because we will die. So we use contemporary alternatives, and so yes, and then so the next stage is basically to retouch the painting, and so I'm just going to flick through quickly and show you that this is the painting before treatment. This is the painting after I'd taken all the varnish off and done all the fills, and then this is the painting after treatment, and I just have a side-by-side of those ones, and it was an absolute, oh, thank you! I'll come in more often. So yeah, it was an absolute pleasure to and privilege to treat this painting. I have really kind of, my family are from Dominica, so being here is absolutely incredible, and being able to work on this painting and this project is just truly fantastic, and that's, yeah. And so I just wanted to finish quickly with kind of introducing very quickly my kind of project that I have started, which is researching the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation in artist materials. So many of the paintings that you see, and when we walk through galleries and museums, they kind of explicitly depict luxuries of Western authorities that were afforded by enslavement and invasion and exploitation. And these are clearly exemplified by white wealthy sitters. But what these legacies are also embedded in implicitly are the pigments that the artists are actually using. So my project focuses on materials found in European paintings. And you can see on the screen, this is my kind of growing list of materials, so it's always changing. And they all have kind of these connections to exploitative and colonial histories. So every material used has its kind of similar but changing global origins that derive from kind of assumption of land and exploitation of people's labor and cultures and that kind of avarice of our Western colonial powers. And so it's exactly this this aspect that my project seeks to kind of explore holistically, as the kind of transformation of these materials into paintings is kind of represented. And so to illustrate this, I just wanted to show you quickly the example of indigo. Whilst I was at the National Gallery, I made a video online, and you can check that out on YouTube, on the National Gallery's YouTube, or on their website. And it is centered around the pigment indigo. And indigo was an extremely important commodity for Spanish, British, French, Dutch, English, which kind of fueled widespread exploitation of humans and the appropriation of land in South and North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and South Asia for centuries. And so colonial indigo plantations around the world relied on forced labor from indigenous people, trafficked West African enslaved people, and exploited South Asian farmers that all these people had centuries of cultural value and spiritual devotion to these materials. So this makes indigo's history and consumption one of great malevolence and bloodshed. So I looked at two portraits of indigo plantation owners and slave owners in the National Gallery collection, and the video kind of traces these exploitative productions across the globe and links these to the pigments in the paintings. So this project for me has been extremely rewarding, as I think it's important where we can to acknowledge, address and celebrate the contributions made by unseen individuals, recognising and celebrating those traditions and cultural values, while remembering the human cost and suffering was immeasurable, and their lives were not embedded not in only in every coin exchanged, but also in each brushstroke and artwork made during these times. And I just want to finish by saying exploited peoples across the globe were denied the benefits they built for others, fostering inherited legacies of inequality, exclusion and discrimination, and which we still continue to stand up to against today. So that's why I believe this project is important. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I ran over.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Definitely fascinating, and I hope your research on indigo will find you back here soon, because it was one of the crops, yeah. So we are going to swiftly move on to a presentation by Anne Bancroft. So I remind you to hold all your questions for Kendall until the Q&A session, which will follow Anne's presentation, which is titled Establishing Conservation in the Heritage Ecosystem. Anne Bancroft is the head of Conservation and Collection Care at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and the Road National Digitization Initiative. Anne has a master's in Buddhist art, history and conservation from the Courtauld Institute, a Master's in Conservation, Camberwell College of Arts, and Bachelor's of Fine Arts from the Barbados Community College. Anne has worked as a preservation and conservation consultant in the Eastern Caribbean, India, Italy, and the UK. She's currently focused on collection care in tropical environments. Anne has also worked as a senior conservator at the V&A Museum, conservator at the Wellcome Collection, Lambeth Place Palace Library, the London Metropolitan Archives, and the Tate Britain. She was an assessor for ICON accreditation candidates. Her main area of research is on the conservation of sacred objects. She has a focus on technical art history and has specialisms in paper, book conservation, and the conservation of Tibetan Buddhist, Asian, and Eastern materials, including painted cloth. She's been a guest lecturer on heritage and conservation programs and runs conservation preservation workshops as a consultant with a focus on capacity building. Anne was the arts director for the UK Shang Tsung Institute, focusing on the preservation of Buddhist culture, and is a member of the ICON Barbados board. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you all. It's great to be here with you all today. My computer looks like if it's going to die, so I might need to switch laptops halfway through. Thank you so much, Kendall, for that presentation. Really clearly outlines the direction of being able to go into conservation, and it's great to hear about other people's journey. Great to hear basically about people's journey and odysseys into the heritage sector. I'm going to speak with you all a little bit today about establishing conservation in the heritage ecosystem, really specifically looking at Barbados's journey and our continued journey. So with further ado, we will go through, and this is an object that we actually did work on from the Moore collection at UE, where there was a little larva popping out, which what I think looks like if it's popping out of a little porthole in the back. Anyway, we digress. So our first part that we have been doing are really doing condition assessments of knowing what's in the collection, and also what is the condition of what's in the collection. So being able to determine things such as what is movable and what is immovable, because as part of our heritage, we have built structures, and sometimes, as our deputy director, Kevin Farmer, will say, it's one of our largest object types. But within these built structures, these historic structures, they hold other objects as well. So there's a kind of interdependentness there. So we have both organic and inorganic material, and as well as composite, which is what Kendall was speaking to earlier on, that paintings, they are made up of composite objects, and you also get that with books and other types of sculptures. So it's really knowing how these materials, what they are, how they have been made, and this helps us to know how to preserve them, as well as to do interventions into them, so conservation, so stabilizing the objects. Okay, so these are some examples of the types of objects that we have here and that are important to our cultural identity. Okay, what we've been doing, and this has been happening maybe from, let's say, the 60s onwards, is mapping but more so in the 80s, where it becomes a little bit with more vigor, is to map the expertise needed to preserve and conserve the material cultural heritage, and all the different people who are involved, from stewards of the collections to have an integrated approach, right? Because there's including things like the preservation, because no sense spending about 200 hours working on an object when you're going to put it back into an environment that is going to get damaged again. So a lot of the time we do things like preventive conservation and to mitigate the agents of deterioration. So here you can see many different types of groups and initiatives that have happened, which include working amongst maintenance team staff members who are caring for historic houses, such as State House, as well as including the Barbados Defence Force, getting them involved as well in responding to emergencies, and our firefighters. All of this this forms an ecosystem so that we can look after our material cultural heritage. It isn't only, for instance, we have the curators do a lot of work, the archivists, the librarians, as well as hopefully now a multitude of conservators with different specialisms that we can have in Barbados. So we're working towards that, right? So if you think about it, we've got paintings, books, papers, outdoor statues, yeah, metalwork, archaeology. All of these objects, which are very precious to us, need to be preserved and conserved and to be interrogated so we can understand more about them. What's great is also for us to actually interrogate them ourselves from our lens, which is, this is our heritage. Yeah, so we bring to it a kind of innate knowledge of these pieces and how it has been used and its significance to us. And in Barbados, it's a very exciting time because we are now a republic. We've been independent for a very long time, and there seems to be a shift and a real investment from government in terms of the preservation of the heritage sector. So we have to carpe diem and just seize as much of these opportunities as we possibly can. But all of this is built on previous work, previous foundations, yeah, from our ancestors. In speaking with so many people about this, the sorts of questions that we've had with conversations in the heritage sector have been, you know, what's the condition of our heritage? Who's conserving the material? For instance, what are they bringing to it? What's their training, right? And also what training is available to us in the region? Because it is very prohibitive to be able to leave Barbados and to be able to go and study abroad. Yeah, there's no conservation courses here. Yeah, and I mean, you can go to Cuba, but that's also, you know, you need to speak Spanish. And some of us have gone to Cuba inside of this room, which we'll give a shout out to two of our young people here. But they have been people who've trained in conservation previously and on the job training, but then they haven't had access to professional development after that. So you get shown how to do something, but then you don't get shown, well, what about the decision making around it? So this isn't a factory, it isn't you do this and you do that and you do the next thing. It's on a case-by-case basis. My voice might go. Access to funding grants. Right now we're establishing the need for, get some water. Oh, I have it here. To funding bodies, and there aren't any national funding bodies per se to look after material cultural heritage. We rely heavily on the Division of Culture for that. But now there's more movement, which started in the 1980s to get national development scholarships in conservation. So that investment is there, and it remains there, especially, you know, it was on the listing this last year, and I think will be on the listing this year. What's been interesting throughout the time is the need to champion professional conservation, formally trained conservators, because it gives a huge foundation within that. So yeah, people have transferable skills, but you need to have that ethical framework as well as this underpinning with what Kendall has spoken about with the science background and the chemistry, so that is actually applied. And that's something that we're lacking now, but they are more conservation courses and online courses that can give you that sort of background. So I think with the shift with COVID, that's one of the things that we've seen in terms of accessibility, virtual accessibility to some of this information, which was completely impenetrable to us because we were not in the global north. Yeah. So again, this is a legacy that has been there, I think, you know, from kind of inception, especially with the not one nail will be made inside of the colonies. So we were always taught to bring in, import, yeah, rely on there. And there are also, the other discussions that we started to have was, well, what about the standards? Because all of the standards and approaches that are taught inside of conservation departments, they're really taught for use in a temperate climate. So now, as an emerging sector, in the Anglophone, well, the Caribbean region, and also in Latin America. They've done a bit more work there because they've had a longer lead-in time than we have in the Anglophone region, is how do we adapt that to a tropical environment? And we've got a challenging environment. So because we've got high temperature, high humidity, loads of insects and mold, etc. So a lot of the leaders of institutions have been really championing the need to have actual post in conservation, as well as to set up a space in which we need to do this. So I'm going to go back a little bit about the lineage of conservation, like we said in the 1980s. And initially, a lot of this, we have Pat Beyer pictured here. Some of you will know this piece as it's in the foyer, done by Alison Chapman Andrews. We can recognize Stanley Graves there. And like I spoke to a bit earlier, the on-the-job training. And there's quite a few of you in this room right now who are having on-the-job training. Yeah, but without the formal training, but yet getting people coming in to do workshops. And that's really, that's great, and that's building us up, yeah? And as well as it's being applicable, because then people can see how you're working within a space as opposed to somewhere else where you have all the resources, you can call a conservation supplier and just say, oh, can I have this? And it gets delivered. We have to wait a little bit longer, and the cost of shipping things over is a little bit more. Yeah, and these things are expensive anyway. So I've spoken a little bit about those things earlier on, but to give you a little bit more of an idea, binderies there were quite a few in Barbados. There was probably about 3 to 4 that were functioning. And then these have been adapted, one of them, to be a conservation lab. So this is the old lab at the National Archives, which has been recently renovated in the last 2 years. But we've had, for instance, like Pat Beyer, visiting conservators coming in, also from Puerto Rico, to work on objects. Yeah? And whenever they've come down, they've worked alongside local people, Bajans, which include probably about 2 of us here in this room today, and that's how I first started to have an understanding of what conservation was, what are you actually doing. So it's this exposure about raising awareness that this is actually a job, and you can get jobs in the heritage sector that relate, for instance, to art, because similar to Kendall, I come from this very much from an art background. And then you can have people coming from a chemistry background and science background, which we'll hear about later, which completely underpins the majority of the work in conservation, but also photography, art history, etc. So there's been lots of workshops that have happened throughout time, raising awareness of what is conservation, as well as the importance of needing it, which includes, for instance, people like Neris Rudda, who ended up also, like myself, getting a National Development Scholarship to study conservation, and other Bajans. So I think there's been about kind of 3 of us. And opportunities just like we have here for this whole week, with skill training opportunities, with people also coming in, and for institutions, national institutions, to be able to work alongside each other whenever there is a particular issue or a workshop, to get together to share these skills. Why? Because we're really small. We can no longer, working in silos is not going to continue to work. So if we pool our resources, and if there's a really interesting project and we come together, then we all learn, yeah, and then we'll all be able to kind of help each other. And I know that's easier said than done, but there's plenty of case studies, such as a project that, again, here's the Richard B. Moore collection, which had a insect infestation, and there was about 3 different institutions that came together to save those objects. And instead of bombing with methyl bromide, which is a very, very harsh chemical, what we did was we treated at low temperature, which was the first time that had ever happened, in the Anglophone region. And so we shifted that, and now this is just, oh yeah, we do this all the time. Yeah? Okay, and writing. I'm quite aware that our director is in the front, and she's been a advocate of making sure that we do write about what we're doing, because there's plenty of other people, especially in the global north, writing on our own material cultural heritage and who we are. So, here's a case study that we did, and we also have this collaborative case study where we need to write. We need to share with each other. We need to share our case studies, to see what's actually possible, and so that our views are also out here. We come from a very oral history type of people, but this is, the writing is kind of like almost etched in stone, and that's really quite important. And that has gone a long way. Moving along is also about our other sister island, the small island developing nations. And what occasionally has happened in Barbados and in the Anglophone region is we've sent objects away from the countries to somewhere else to get conserved because we had no choice. And that continues. Like, even I know in the UK when I was there, other places were sending objects, for instance, to Japan to get worked on by national treasures, and that's really great. But to be able to, if we can do that here, and so they don't have to go through that travel, then I think that's probably going to be a little bit more sustainable. And so then instead of this constant perpetuation of reliance on the global north, then we're able to preserve and conserve our own material cultural heritage, as well as to raise awareness with the people who are using the collections, handling and interfacing with them, so that they handle them really well. We control the environment, so then we don't have to intervene by doing conservation treatments. I'm going to go back to this just to actually say that it's something that I've discussed with colleagues, and we were discussing this at lunch as well. While we were waiting for lunch, which is, it makes a difference conserving your own material cultural heritage, whether it's of your religious, national, cultural heritage, or ritual cultural heritage. There is an innate thing. This. You've grown up with this. Your grandmother talked about this particular objects. I think we were talking the other day about on the Brunius piece, she's slapping some cloth with something in her hand, and we're saying, it's a pity it wasn't a jucking board, because that would be a good visual reference. But that kind of innate knowledge makes a huge difference. I believe. And I think now where we are, we have such momentum. I'm so excited. This is from when I was starting and even just found out what conservation was. But, there are jobs in conservation right now. I trained over about, 20-something years ago, and there were no jobs. But some of you here are working in conservation on the job training, and we'll be going out to get formal training very, very soon, and have had a lot more exposure. And again, like I say, there are scholarships now that weren't available before, and there's refurbishment of one lab, as well as the creation of another lab. And there is the impetus to have a conservation center of excellence, which hopefully then we can service the rest of the Anglophone region, and to help to bring our other Caribbean region up to the same level and beyond, and maybe even eventually in some areas be leaders into that field. So I think it's just very, like I say, very exciting. And I know that there's so many of you in here who are seizing these opportunities, and it's not easy, and it takes a lot of dedication, and many of you have been thrown into the deep end. But it's such a rich time, and to be able to interface directly with conservation scientists, as well as professionals in different disciplines, because when it's really important to have that exposure. And it isn't a given that this isn't happening, as far as I'm aware, in other places in the region. Again, we we are leading the way in this. So hopefully this is the sort of thing that could be repeated, I guess, is what I want to kind of get across. Yeah. And hopefully the people who are dealing with policy can continue to champion so that we can continue on this trajectory as well. So I'm going to leave that there right now with food for thought, and just say that, it's great to have this opportunity, and to also say that, for instance, even conservators in other places in Europe, they don't even have conservation scientists in their institutions. And here we have two experts who are working on our piece. And then we also have people who are now on that trajectory to become conservation scientists themselves, as well as people who want to become paintings conservators and archaeological conservators, so that we can add value to the understanding of the material cultural heritage, because conservators don't only spruce things up, okay, which is a term that we've used. Has been used towards me, and it wasn't very well received. We do spruce things up, but we just do it with much rigor, expertise, and ethics background. So thank you.
So we now have an opportunity for audience Q&A. So I'm going to ask Kendall and Anne to bring their chairs here in the middle. And do we have any questions? I'm going to get you guys to hold the mic. And I think anyone in the audience, do we have any questions? Yes, Jada.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I was distracted.
I was saying that they're very much encouraged to sort of document their discoveries and what they learn, etc. And I was wondering what would be, as a member of the public, my way of accessing that sort of information for my own knowledge or research. Where would I go?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. There are really great online resources that show technical analysis and research and things that people have found about paintings. The National Gallery has a technical bulletin, which is fantastic, the National Gallery of London. There's also really great museums have really great kind of YouTube and Instagram and social media. They do post a lot on there. And there's, also maybe some like published articles that might be a little bit dense, actually. Sometimes they're quite boring. No offense, everything's important and really great. But yeah, how would you find information on other things people have found, like
You've also said icon as well, and so I think there's quite a lot, and you know this, Jada, as well, with what is it? Yeah, ICOM, Museums Association of the Caribbean, as well. So there are more things being written and held, and I think online searches. So there's Chin, as well. There's so many places. It depends what you're interested, what you want to focus in on too. And there's also things like online blogs. I know the V&A has the conservation journals there as well. And then there's things to look at, the intangible cultural heritage publications, which we have one of the previous editors here, UNESCO, ICOM-CC. There's so many. So I think you have to try and choose.
what you're interested in. Yeah, you know, yeah.
Online. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also lots of like great projects that are quite like mainly in like the like Europe, quite important and famous. Like there's the current Night Watch project that's going on at the Rijksmuseum, and there's been really great projects with the girl with the pearl earring as well. That is all very accessible. There's also yeah. So it depends. Yeah, it depends what you're into. Sorry, I'm just very paintings focused. Is it paintings that you like? Oh.
One of the courses I'm interested in is museum paintings, but the lesson is treating objects with stone, wood, decorative surfaces.
Okay, yeah, we should talk later. Thank you very much for your question.
Excuse me. Kendall mentioned about filling.
Mm.
I assume you meant where parts of the paint have fallen off of the canvas in the restoration of that painting. What did you use, or how did you go about filling those areas? And did you have to match the weave or the reaction of the paint on the original weave?
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant question. Sorry, I skipped over that quite quickly. So yeah, you're exactly right. There's losses to the kind of paint level. So if it's like bumpy with a brush stroke and then a paint loss and it dips, you have to fill that in and texture it so it kind of doesn't look like it's a loss. And so I use a chalk putty that is water soluble. So it's chalk and gelatin with a tiny bit of PVA to give it kind of some flexibility, because canvases are always kind of moving. And so yeah, I fill that in that raking light so I can really see the texture across the painting and replicate that texture, and then let that dry, and then kind of retouch over that and blend it all in and reintegrate that loss.
So that filling material then is not likely to crack because the movement of the canvas
Yeah,
result in cracking if it's not susceptible to
I'm
protective against.
I'm sure in maybe 50 years' time, 100 years' time, it's definitely going to crack. A lot of the kind of fills that we see from previous restorers, like 50 years ago from me, have cracked. So we try and use things that are that do age well and are reversible. But if I'm honest, if it does crack, most paintings are cracked. So it's actually going to look even better.
You should keep the cracks rather than show the age of it.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Yeah.
the ongoing need for restoration then provides further work for restorers such as yourself.
Yeah. So we never badmouth the restorers that come before us, but they did do and use some crazy things that we are now having to kind of take away and kind of redo. So if anything, yeah, they're giving us opportunities. Thank you very much for your question.
We had one in the front and then Pranav after. Yeah.
Could you appreciate the merit of having a preemptive preservative consultation before those projects that bear some cultural and historical potential with respect to heritage are enacted? For example, if we want to have a statue with respect to the materiality of it being metal, perhaps advice as to the purity of that metal, or if the metal itself bears some risk, then a varnish to add some further protection before certain initiatives are carried out, whether with respect to government or private entities.
All fantastic question and questions. Yeah, no, it was beautiful. It was beautifully put. Yes,
I'm going to present myself a bit better as well to your benefit.
it was presented well. Okay, my apologies. Go ahead. Yeah.
Is there some merit in a preemptive preservative consultation before initiatives that bear the potential of being, whether on the merit of culture or history or religion, heritage of some significance, whether governmental or private, before those are undertaken, whether with respect to the materiality of the project itself, like metal, perhaps the purity of it, or an alloy, or some preservative measures with respect to varnish that are better suited in the long run further on to avoid certain errors that might arise in conservation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I'd like to just start also by saying now in the conservation and heritage sector field, there are things called ethics checklists, where we are it's almost like a code of ethics that you sign up to, and you're supposed to engage with the stakeholders around the object. So engagement with the stakeholders doesn't necessarily mean we have to manage expectations that we will do exactly what the stakeholder has said, and there are many experts involved into one object. So it could be the artist. We would take a stare from a conservation scientist to say, oh, well, what is the materiality? And sometimes if the artist is alive, we would, or say the artist's son, for instance, is alive, we would speak to them and say, well, what did we use? So I'm using that analogy because I do know that we have Virgil Brutegan here, and we have consulted him on things like the cleaning of his father's statues. Yeah. So we try to get as much information as possible. And I think now artists are even more aware of when they're producing things that they have to think about the longevity of the materials. I know having some of us from the art college may not have thought about that because finances are a thing when you're producing artwork. But yeah, it's an important factor. So this goes back to the ecosystem to try and create. So if we raise awareness by speaking with art students and art producers, then we have a little bit more understanding. And then if we have an understanding of the materiality and how that ages, what Kendall said about aging, the aging materials, again, but that's a lot of research, scientific research has been done on that, how materials age in temperate climates, and we have a consistent temperature and high humidity. So has anybody written on that? Which is why I'm going to go, people who want to be conservation scientists out there, those are lovely PhDs for you all to be working on. Subtle hint, hint.
That's a very good one.
Yeah, I guess that's as best as I can respond to it. I know it doesn't answer it. Kendall, can you add to that as well?
No. That was very brilliantly done.
I don't know about that. Sandra?
He said, is there merit?
There's merit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, there's merit. We need to do this. Because, look, this environment's real tough. We lose things. You know, there can be natural disasters, there can be slow wear and tear. We got real mischievous termites both underneath the ground and above the ground who are eating things out, foxing on our beautiful papers if you all have prints on it. Yeah, it's problematic. You've seen the iron gall ink problem. That's exacerbated a lot. Yeah. But we can, the more we know about the materiality, the better we can deal with this. And again, why is getting the skills important? Because the key trope, I'm kind of quoting here, that's used in the global north for not having our objects back and repatriation, you know, of course, the most famous one is the Benin bronzes, is because both in Africa and also in this region, we don't have the skills to look after our own material cultural heritage. We don't have the housing to do this. So if we get this, then it goes a long way for us to get our material back. And repatriation is not only about the physical objects, but it's about the skills and the knowledge and the investment and resources. Pranav? Okay. And I have a question for the director as well after that.
Yeah. I can project my voice, no worries.
Well, yeah, but the people online might not hear you.
Right. Question for Kendall. Regarding the headless smoking individual in the painting, I just wanted to know what the research and decision-making process was. Was it a mix of scientific and historical analysis? And yeah, I imagine that that process can apply to a lot of the decision making that goes on in conservation. So can you just go into it a bit?
I think, yeah, it does. Sorry. And there are many kind of things. If there's a big area of loss, if there's like small area of losses like that, having that kind of privilege to scientists that analyze our paintings. I did skip over an analytical technique which my colleagues will be describing much better than I ever could. So having that and kind of seeing if we can find any remnants of what was supposed to be there and kind of figure it out is really important. So having that scientific analysis technique to see what we can't see is fantastic. To kind of understand what should be put back in a loss, and then the art historical context. So if there's any kind of prints that have been made after the painting, or if there's any photographs of the painting before it got damaged, or any descriptions or understandings, then that research is really important to kind of understand again what should be put back in a loss. Talking about the headless figure and the research that I did on the kind of Newton burial ground and the contemporary writings of the time, and then talking about like the stakeholders as well, and who is decision making. I think as conservators, sometimes we are thought of as kind of just the hands, the technicians, but we that's why we kind of emphasize that we do need all these kind of three areas of understanding, and the curators are incredibly important parts of our institutions as well, along with the scientists, and I think all kind of three of us and everyone else as well in the museum. Like, this is the thing, it's like having those conversations and kind of deciding those things as well is really, it's not just us deciding, we have to have those kind of talks together. And you talking about conserving our own cultural heritage as well, and how that's an extremely important thing to do, because we understand we have a stake in what is like happening, and we have that kind of enthusiasm and passion. So that as well is important. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, okay, good.
Jada has another question, and then we can have one more from the audience.
I just had, this is ain't loud enough. I just, sorry. Oh, my apologies. I just had one question. You would have explained to us your technique and the reasoning behind why you filled in the losses and imitated the brushstroke, and you would have also explained to us the various pigments and paints you use. But my question was sort of the reasoning around, like, what artistic technique did you then use on top of that to fix the pictorial layer? Because looking at the images, I understood it wasn't just about like utilizing pointillism to fill in the color loss. Why is it for this particular case you had used so much detail to recreate the face despite not having a lot of information as to what would have been there before? Why not just imply that this was, you know?
Oh my God. No, fantastic question. There's lots of ethics about retouching and approaches to retouching. That is an area of study that you do when you kind of study conservation in kind of Europe and America and the United States. The approach to, in Britain and the United States, the approach to kind of filling those losses and retouching is to do something called, now my brain has gone dead. I can't think of the word, but we reintegrate it, like was never, we fully kind of create kind of what was there and kind of make sure that the painting is being read like it was supposed to be read, or how the kind of condition of it is now is supposed to be read. Whereas there are some places in Italy, say, where they approach retouching completely differently. They do something like what you were talking about, like just kind of putting kind of lines there and suggesting that there was going to be a head there, or suggesting that there's kind of a shape, or in many circumstances they just completely kind of put a colour on the loss and just let the rest of the painting speak for itself. I can't say if one is better than the other, or ethically if one is better than the other. I think if I didn't know what to put there, I wouldn't have done that. I would have gesturally suggested a head. But I think for that point that I made, it's just important to have that kind of history and context put back in the painting. And the fact that, as I said, the darker skinned figures had been overcleaned and removed, which again suggests that the head before was a darker skinned figure that was just completely removed. So just having those identifiable points, the research, the kind of evidence, and we did scan the painting, but not in that much detail. But if we did, we could have done it in that much detail. But I'm sorry, I just got ahead of myself, and I decided to put it back because I thought it was important. So I made that choice.
We do have one question online, if I can read it out. So they say, hi, wonderful presentations. As it relates to technological aspects of conservation, how can digital tools be implemented to help preserve and promote cultural heritage?
What's springing to mind, and I'm gonna pass over also to the conservation scientists as well, is reconstructions of what was there before. I know we've had this with a lot of sculpture, with polychromy, that's been completely gone. So we think this thing was, you know, just this white sculpture, and then like marble statue, and then you go and you do your conservation science, and I'm going to hand over to conservation scientists, and then you realize, oh look, there is some evidence that there is paint there, and then you do a reconstruction, and you can also do this in 3D. So that's the most obvious one that I think springs to mind.
Another example is where not that the paint or the colorant is gone totally, but it's changed. And so, for instance, in some cases, you can reconstruct what a painting would have looked like before a particular pigment faded, or just changed to a different color entirely in some cases. So that's another simple application that's been done.
I mean, the word digital tools is or a phrase is very broad, right? So there's a whole range of things. But one of the things that you all are doing is making digital reproductions of fragile works, documents, to allow scholars and the public to interact with them and preserve the original object for many years to come. So one of the key aspects of inviting digital tools and imaging into preservation is to create surrogate objects that live a digital life and can go to any part of the globe and to be opened and accessed widely by folks who can't get to the archives or would not, be allowed to handle something that is so fragile that it would be detrimental to it. So I think that would be a key work that you all are already undertaking.
Okay, so another round of applause for Kendall and Anne. We are now going going to move swiftly into the second segment of our program of presentations. With the presentation, Helping Objects Tell Their Stories, Scientific Research in Museum Collections by Dr. Anniko Bazur and Dr. Richard Hark. Dr. Anniko Bazur is the Wallace S. Wilson Director of Scientific Research at Yale University's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. She holds a PhD in Materials Science and Engineering from the University of Arizona. Before joining Yale in 2012, Dr. Bazur was the Andrew W. Mellon Research Scientist at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the Mennel Collection, and held roles as an Associate Conservation Scientist at the Art Institute of Chicago and a faculty member in the Art Conservation Department of SUNY Buffalo State University. At Yale, Dr. Bazur established a scientific research laboratory dedicated to understanding the materials that constitute objects in the university collections, studying how they age and degrade over time. Their work informs conservation treatment decisions and provides insight into how objects were created and used throughout history. Throughout her career, Dr. Bazur has collaborated on studying a diverse range of objects, including pre-colonial copper alloys in northern Peru, 18th century European porcelain, 19th century salted paper print photographs, Velázquez's Education of the Virgin, and the Voynich cipher manuscript. She's mentored conservators and scientists throughout her career, supporting their professional development and advancing conservation science. As part of these efforts, Dr. Bazur developed the X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy boot camp for conservators workshop and co-authored the open access resource Handheld XRF in Cultural Heritage, a practical workbook for conservators. And Dr. Richard Hark is a senior conservation scientist at Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. Dr. Hart earned a doctorate in organic chemistry from the University of Pennsylvania. His academic career has included additional appointments at Marietta College and Juniata College, where he was the George Foster Professor of Chemistry before gaining emeritus status in 2019. Dr. Hark is the recipient of several awards for teaching excellence and is the author of over 50 publications. His early work included the synthesis of complex natural products and the development of novel reagents for visualizing latent fingerprints, a project conducted in conjunction with the U.S. Secret Service. Prior to joining IPCH, Dr. Hark's research efforts were focused on the application of analytical and imaging techniques to the study of cultural heritage objects, the analysis of geological materials and items of forensic interest, using laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, and the synthesis of isotopically labeled organic compounds. His current work includes diverse projects involving scientific analysis of the Vinland map and its sister manuscripts, 16th to 18th century British portraiture, the Gutenberg Bible and related incunables, 15th century Taraki cards, and William Henry Fox Talbot's The Pencil of Nature. His work on the analysis of art and artifacts has been published in a variety of journals, including Applied Spectroscopy, Journal of Archaeological Sciences, Journal of Raman Spectroscopy, Materia, Journal of Technical Art History, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Hart previously spent sabbatical leaves at IPCH, University College London, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Plus, he has collaborated with researchers at Winterthur Museum. He also taught a multidisciplinary course called The Chemistry of Art for many years, often in conjunction with an art historian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bazur and Dr. Hart for their presentation.
There we go. All right, thank you very much. I have to shorten that short bio. It wasn't very short. I apologize. I can't tell you how excited we are to be here, for this invitation to come and to share some things with you today, and just for this experience in general. I've had the opportunity to work with and interact with many of you, and it's really been wonderful. It gives me great hope in the exact direction that Anne was talking about, that there's great things coming for cultural heritage and preservation in Barbados. So very briefly, you heard about some of the things I've done, but how did I actually decide that I wanted to do the application of science to cultural heritage? This is not a field that generally a young child is going to tell their grandparents, this is what I want to be when I grow up. They're not going to be saying, I want to work with artworks and apply scientific tools to better understand our cultural heritage. It's something that kind of grows on you. And for me, it's been a journey of over 25 years. And it stems from the natural curiosity that I have about the world around me. That's why I became a scientist, because it helped me to explain and understand that world. And if I can apply those tools and that natural curiosity to better understanding our cultural heritage, that helps me to not only understand the stories of these objects, but the people who made them and the people who view them. So it's been a real labor of love for me. So in order to give you a sense of the tools we use, I'm going to tell you the story of these tarocchi cards. Now, you might better know these sort of things as tarot. That's the French word. Tarocchi is the original Italian word, and it didn't begin as a way to tell your fortune, but rather as a card game. And literally, the deck of 52 cards we have today is a descendant of this. But these cards that I'm showing you here come from different collections. The one on the left is from Yale, is one of the cards from Yale. The deck is not 52. It's actually originally something above 80. The next one comes from the Morgan Library in New York, and the last two come from collections in Italy. I'm not going to go into great detail about all of the story of the tarocchi cards, but I'd be glad to tell you more if you wanted to ask. But I will highlight the fact that this represents a multi-institution, multi-continent collaborative effort, because there's at least 5 collecting institutions and scientists and conservators from 6 different institutions have all come together in order to tell the story of these fascinating cards. Now, in case you're wondering, they're only about this big. They're quite small, but they're really intricate, and they have an incredible story that we're helping to elucidate through finding out what are the materials that were used to make them and the techniques that were applied. So, as Kendall already mentioned, these are 3-dimensional objects. Everything is basically a 3-dimensional object. It's a matter of how thick is that 3rd dimension. And so these are quite thin, only about 1 millimeter thick. They're very thin, and they're basically made with an early kind of pasteboard. Literally, you glue pieces of paper together. But you can see that there's metal leaf, there's paint layers, there's preparatory layers, there's drawing, there's incision with a blunt tool in order to create shapes. So there's a lot to this 3D structure, and we would like to know how it was done. So in terms of the details here, if we look at this first card, this is faith. The cardinal virtues are represented in the Yale deck. We have faith, hope, and charity. And there's a great deal you can learn, as was indicated, just by looking very closely with a stereo microscope. You can see great details of how faces and other features are created. And so if we go all the way up to something like about 100-time magnification, you can see the fine details of individual eyes or lips. And we have entire comparisons of the way the eyes were painted on these various cards. And that helps us to understand that it's not the same hand. One person didn't make all of those cards that are in the collection. So just spending time with a microscope is really helpful. Now, that also means that we can sometimes turn these things on their side and see that it's basically like a layer cake. We can even analyze the glue that was used to paste these together and discover it's kind of like gelatin. And we can even know what animals it came from. So for the most part, what I'm going to share with you is a quick story of the main thing that we tend to do, and that is we use light to interrogate objects. Literally, it's like we're asking a question, and how the light responds with the material gives us clues as to what it's made out of. And so if this slide just represents the different things that can happen when light strikes the surface of an object. It can go right through it. We call that being transparent. Or it can do any of these other things. The one I'm going to focus on first happens to refer to reflection, but a little later on I'll talk about fluorescence. That's the one on the far right there. So each of these have some different technique that gives us some clue about the materials involved in an object. So this is the rainbow, right? The beautiful rainbow flying into Barbados. It was gorgeous from the sky. But this is the limit of what our eyes can see. So basically, all the instruments we use are just expanding those limits. Just like a microscope, or a telescope for that matter, allows you to see smaller or farther away, the tools we have go beyond the visible region, okay? So for instance, we can go all the way to the ultraviolet. And this is what you're trying to not get too much of if you spend too much time on the beach. But we can't see into the ultraviolet. Now, can anything see into the ultraviolet? Well, it turns out, yes, some insects can. Butterflies, for instance. Flowers that might look a certain color to us look different to them. And so the tools we use would be the imaging tools that were referred to earlier by Kendall. So for instance, if we shine ultraviolet light on the cards, you can see that they look very, very different. And that helps to give us a clue as to what the materials might be. So different pigments respond differently to ultraviolet light. Of course, we have to use a special camera to do all this. And for those of you who come over for the demonstration, you'll see that. We can also go to the other side of the electromagnetic spectrum and see infrared light. And you may wonder, well, can anything see in the infrared? Well, it turns out some snakes can. Like a pit viper can actually sense prey because of the heat coming from it. That's infrared. And so when we do the same sort of thing, we can get a different response from pigments. We can also see through the upper pigment layers, as Kendall indicated. And so you can see here that there's a wide range of responses of the various visible pigments you see here, and that's very helpful for figuring things out. We also can play some tricks digitally to achieve what are called false color infrared and false color UV images. So these are all just tools that we have at our disposal. We can go even a little further, and instead of just saying a simple ultraviolet or infrared, we can use multiple wavelengths. And instead of generating just a simple image, we can generate what we call a hypercube. It's a whole bunch of images. So we need to use machine learning tools, literally AI, in order to sort it all out. But when we do that, that can give us clues as to what the specific pigments are. So moving ahead, what if we go all the way out to X-rays? Kendall mentioned doing radiography, and that's kind of like what happens at a dentist's office or the hospital if you have a regular X-ray. By the way, can anything see in X-rays? Well, there's only one that I know of, and apparently he wasn't available for this study. But in any case, that's just a simple radiograph. This is like the dentist's office looking at your teeth. And so you can see that some pigments are going to allow the X-rays to pass through more easily than other places. But we can do something else, and that's what you'll see over in the gallery. We can do something called X-ray fluorescence. And remember, spectroscopy is just this idea of interrogating objects with light. So if it's set up something like that, this is what it does. We fire X-rays at the material, right? And different X-rays come back. Now, when I say different, I mean they have different energy. And it turns out the energy is different for each of the various elements. And so that means that we can identify a particular element that might be present in the surface of the material. For instance, that's shown as copper. Cu is the abbreviation for copper. And if we go a little bit further, this is what the whole spectrum looks like. But nobody wants to look at a bunch of lines like that, though some of you have been spending some time doing this recently, and you're very good at it. What we really would like to do is to map an entire surface so that it's not just a point measurement. And so what we can do is get maps for each of the various elements that show up in the spectrum. And literally, we get a spectrum for each point. And you'll see in just a moment, that will finish up there. You know, I'll hurry it up. And so you can see the distribution of the elements. Now, that doesn't specifically tell us what the pigment is, the colorant, but it gives us a chance to make a pretty good guess as to what we have. So for instance, these are false color maps. We can make them any color we want that represent the copper, calcium, and lead that I showed you. The lead there on the right, that's probably the pigment lead white. The copper, you can see how it matches up pretty well with the blue areas. That's the mineral azurite. And so this gives us a distribution and identification at the same time. So here's just some images of those Tarocchi cards being imaged or analyzed with X-ray systems. There's 3 different systems. The one in the upper right is the one where we can scan. But all these other ones will do scanning. They're just smaller. Okay, so one of the things that happens is it turns out that atoms inside of us and inside of the pigments are always vibrating, like you see there. And each of those different motions corresponds to a different energy. And so we can do something called infrared or Raman spectroscopy. This is using a different type of light to get different type of information. So if we look at this card, this is the love card. See the couple there underneath a little tent with a cupid flying above. You get different spectra. Again, they just look like lumps, right? You have to know how to interpret it by comparing it with known materials. But this allows us to specifically say what the particular pigment might be. So if we do point measurements with this approach and then use that distribution approach I was showing earlier, we can get a pretty good idea of what we're looking at in these cards. So again, these are what the instruments look like. They can be big things, or on the lower left there, you see a little tiny instrument is actually portable. We don't have one of those, otherwise we probably would have brought it along. In any case, let me just briefly tell you what did we learn but using these kinds of tools and others. Well, I'll just do a comparison of the cards that are at Yale versus the ones in New York. So you can see that these are match sets. It's the same type of card, but different approaches. So there's a lot of study with curators and conservators just considering how are they painted. But when we start looking at other things, like for instance, the metal leaf that's put on. So what I'm showing here is the gold and silver maps just for the cards from the Morgan Library in New York. Can you see how there's a bit of brighter spot? Wherever it's brighter, that means there's more of that element. And can you see how there's the spot here in, for instance, the Page of Cups? It's bright there, and it's bright in the same place in the gold map. This means that these aren't separate gold and silver. It's one piece of metal that's a combination of gold and silver. It's called oro di meta. It's a special kind of gold leaf. And you compare that, for instance, with what you get for the Yale cards. You can again see that there's the brighter spots, but it's only gold. There's some silver used, but it's just for highlights, like the fancy hat that the Page of Cups is wearing. You can also see that unlike the Yale or the Morgan cards, which tended to have sort of square pieces, that's kind of how metal leaf comes, these are all generally pieced together with smaller bits here or there. So it tells us about the differences between the artists who made these 2 different sets. And this is just a summary of the entire palette of the artist who created these 2 sets of cards with the different colors. So we'll be happy to show you a little bit more about this when we're over there, but you have some visuals to go along with it. And I'll turn the time over now to Aniko to tell you about a different story.
Thanks so much. Thank you also for having us here. And yes, thank you. All right. Can everyone hear me all right in the room? Okay. So I appreciate Richard introducing you to some of the tools we use, and now you see some of the pictures of what it's like to do our work, and you'll get to see us in person. And I wanted to follow on his introduction as to how he got into conservation science. My background is in chemistry, and I learned about this fusion of chemistry and art history and creating art when I was an undergraduate student. I was really getting to fall in love with taking art history courses. I was at a liberal arts college, so you had to take, social sciences and art history, and I was grumbling initially, this is really not going to help me graduate with organic chemistry or analytical chemistry, but I sat through classes of architectural history and the art of Rome, and I just thought, there's something to this. I really, really like what I'm seeing. And I had a chemistry professor who said, there's a way to do both. And he introduced me to the field of conservation, and I met a scientist at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, which is where near where I went to college, and he's still there as a scientist. Richard Newman, this is a shout out to him. He's an amazing mentor. Once you kind of see, when you see a person or a thing, and you can really identify with that passion, that amazing privilege of working with objects and learning about them and helping to tell their stories, it got me hooked, and I decided to pursue graduate school and learn about material science and engineering, how materials are made, how they change, and change with time. And that was my path into the field of heritage science or conservation science. So I've been really fortunate to get to know about this from the beginning of my training, and to have been able to pursue it as a career. And one of the things that has drawn me is something that I share with Richard, is a curiosity and a passion for storytelling. I was one of those kids where grandma had to read me the story like the same way. If you skipped a page or you didn't make that sound when the monster said something, then you needed to repeat that. Does anyone has that experience with either children or grandchildren? That was me. So stories have always been really important, and family history is handed down through meaningful objects, and photos are something that I really connect with. So that's been one of my joys in this field, is to partner with art historians, partner with makers to learn about objects that have entered into our collections, often without their full stories. And we're here in a history museum and an art museum where a lot of the collections, and we're surrounded by stories, objects, where we know who has handled them, who held them, what they used them for. And that is so important in understanding and thinking about our place in the world. But many collections have objects in them where we see them, we appreciate their beauty, we kind of see that they could be connected to something, but we don't quite know where they came from. And that's such an exciting part to be, an exciting work to be part of, is to explore this together with different experts. So what you're seeing here are two paintings from the collection of the Yale University Art Gallery. They are a pair. They are very similar in style. They're the same. We think they're the same artist, and they depict a woman and their helper facing kind of toward the middle. These are wall painting fragments, and I'll tell you why we think that. And we think that they're part of a bigger composition where there was a central figure, and they were looking at that central figure. And I wanted to tell this story because I think it helps kind of showcase the collaborations that we so enjoy and benefit from. So this is our team working on this. Denise Leidy, who's the curator of Asian art at Yale University Art Gallery, and Gabrielle New, who at the time of the study was a postdoctoral student, and she really was interested in exploring and sharing, publishing on these unpublished works, sharing them with the world. And they came into the care of Anne Gunnison, who's an objects conservator at the Art Gallery, and Marcy Wiggins, who's now going to be working with my colleague Richard Newman soon. She was a postdoctoral student and now an assistant conservation scientist with us. So a big team of 5 people working on these objects with the help of others. So what do you do when you have objects in your collection that, you know, sort of look like things? What do we know about these when we look at them? So this is where cultural historians like Denise and Gabrielle come in and look at the patterns of flowers and how the decorations on the garments were depicted. And Gabrielle really dug into the archaeological record, finding little known publications about excavations in Mongolia, in Inner Mongolia, and finding depictions of textile patterns that have this type of petals, larger petals and smaller petals surrounded by foliage and garlands, and thinking about the same type of elements and tracing them throughout these images, thinking that, you know, this places them somewhere in Mongolia or China. Her further research in similar depictions of complexions and faces led her to 13th century Buddhist art. This is a Guanyin sculpture showing a similar rounded chin, pursed lips, arched eyebrows, slightly baggy under eyes, and thinking that whoever created these objects must have been somewhat familiar with these types of depictions of humans. You know, is this placing us potentially into 13th century China? But despite her exhaustive research, she couldn't quite find something that matched closely. There wasn't an exact, very similar painting in published works. So this kind of set us to really look closer into the archives and into the materials themselves of this object to figure out where and when and where it could have been made. So before showing you some of that, I wanted to, you'd probably wondered, how do you know this is a wall painting? It's not on a wall. So when you look at the edge of this painting, what we see is sort of an earthenware material underneath a very thin paint layer, and you can see paper and textile at the back. How do we arrive at this? So wall paintings can be separated from their walls. They are typically applied to a wall, whether it's brick or stone or other construction. There's a plaster preparation that provides a smooth surface, and that has then a paint layer on it. To separate a painting from a wall, you have to typically put a facing on it. So you would apply a thin layer of an adhesive, and then you would probably put some paper or a textile on top. And then you can go and separate the wall painting from the backing from the wall using sharp tools. This is the sort of separation that can happen with any types of wall painting. And then you need to take the facing off. So first you have to put something on its back, such as this kind of coarse paper and textile. And then you can reinforce it. That's what we are seeing in our case. We see this paper and textile, and then you can remove the front. So that's how you get a wall painting off a wall and into a collection. It's sort of a strange thing to have a wall painting. And when this painting arrived at the art gallery, it was in frames, kind of presented as easel paintings. And our colleague Ann Gunnison went into the archives to understand how these arrived to the art gallery, learning that they were in the collection of Otto Kahn, who died an untimely early death in 1934, and Otto Kahn's widow, Addie Kahn, inherited the objects, and her children gave them to the art gallery in the 50s. And so she found traces of this object in the inventory of Otto Kahn and the company that held the object as a private holding company. And then she found that there's some, they went through Berlin through a dealer. This was reinforced by finding some German language newspaper on the back. So this is the object telling its story a little bit. Finding letters from the dealer that says, you purchased this thing and we will be shipping them to you in New York City. So her diligent work in the archives connected the object back from the Yale Art Gallery to the collection of Otto and Addie Kahn. We knew this since they donated the work, back to a dealer in Berlin who was then connected to another guy, Jörg Trubner, who probably purchased the object somewhere in China, possibly from this person. And then the trail goes cold. So what do you do with an object that's been detached from its building, where we don't know where it was before the 1920s? So this is where trying to look at the materials and the techniques can really help us clue us in. We found these beautiful, almost three-dimensional reliefs on the painting that are created kind of like icing. Is any cake decorators in the room here? You know when you're piping out thicker icing to create decorations, that's how some of the surface was treated. And this technique really connects it to Chinese wall painting tradition, so it helps us anchor this in China. And then we started to look at what are the materials that this is made of to deepen our understanding. We used the scanning X-ray fluorescence technique that Richard talked about and established that there is a calcium-rich layer where it's bright pink throughout. This is the bottom foundational layer onto which the painting was painted. And when we looked at details where this beautiful technique, this relief technique was made, we found that just as reference books describe, it was made by piping out a calcium-rich icing or material onto the surface. And then that was covered with silver leaf, which is a beautiful way to create shiny details. Of course, now the silver has tarnished, so it gives us a sense of trying to imagine what would this have originally appeared like. So we connected this with a particular Chinese making tradition. We looked at the different elements that would be also traditional to Chinese wall painting materials. We're fortunate that many things have been published about Chinese wall painting techniques, and found that in addition to some red lead, which was used for the lips and some of the facial outlines of the women, there's a lot of iron-based red pigments, which all check out as characteristic for the region and for 14th to 16th century works. We were very interested in understanding how the beautiful greens and blues were depicted, and my colleague Marcy was very happy to see a lot of copper used for these colors because she studied copper-based greens in Chinese paintings for her dissertation, and we were thinking this is great. We have all the materials and the techniques are coming together to point to China to a particular time period. And then as we examined the maps, we found that there's also, in addition to copper, there's some arsenic present. So we use a technique of overlaying false colors to show where elements show up together. We chose red for arsenic, and you see that these beautiful yellow details have arsenic in them, likely in the form of a yellow arsenic based pigment called orpiment, an orange one, realgar. And then where copper in blue and arsenic appear together, blue and green, green and red pixels make yellow altogether. So in these areas where you see yellow colors and orange colors, those are actually where copper and arsenic happens together. And we thought, well, maybe there's a mixture of yellows and copper-containing greens and blues. So we took a sample and took a look at it. This is what a polished paint cross-section looks like from this painting. A little similar to what we've seen Kendall show us, except here there is a big earthenware layer at the bottom. And we mapped with an electron microscope where all the elements are. So this is just an image of all the pigments. And you can see that there is copper and chlorine together in many of the green particles, which is a good sign. It's a sign that we have some traditional copper chloride trihydroxide pigments. But then when we add the arsenic map, we see that arsenic and copper happen together. They are contained together in some of the green pigments. And this co-occurrence is unfortunately the sign that we have a pigment, emerald green, that was first developed in 1814. We verified this with another analytical technique. And this is a beautiful green pigment that means, and its presence throughout the painting, including very close to the foundational layers, means that it cannot be older than 18th century, than the 19th century. Further, looking around on the pigment palette, we also found chrome yellow and Prussian blue. So these are all human-made synthetic pigments that establish that this work is 19th century or younger, and that the makers were able to take advantage of what we would consider modern materials. This is not great news for someone who's really hoping to find a 14th century Chinese wall painting fragment. But it's also a very interesting story in that we have something that is visually so connected to the 14th and earlier centuries, but materially, it's much newer. So it brings us to understanding how new, really. The analysis also discovered that barium and zinc elements are tracked together throughout the painting. And again, analysis of cross-sections helped show that the specific pigments that are mixed together are barium sulfate and zinc sulfide. And these two pigments in this very intimate mixture are related to a pigment mixture that was made in the late 19th century. It's called lithopone. So the discovery and confirmation of lithopone meant that, in fact, this work is even younger. Probably at the earliest, it could have been painted in the 1880s, because lithopone was patented in 1874 in Europe. So why care about this, right? It's a very curious story of a painting that travels from China through Berlin to the United States that looks very convincingly old, uses Chinese painting techniques and traditional materials as well as modern ones. It's really just the beginning of a story of now knowing this information. It'd be really important to understand how, whether these were actual temple paintings that were meant to evoke an older style, or were they made specifically for a export market, because in the late 19th and early 20th century, that export market to the United States was heating up. And why it's important kind of for outside of Yale is that we are learning about a collection of objects that were owned by another collector, another American collector, who donated them to several museums in the United States, including our neighbors in Hartford, the Wadsworth Atheneum. We helped them with the analysis of this painting, and it turns out it also contains lithopone. And so it is also late 19th century at best. And we know of a similar painting at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And there are at least 5 to 7 different locations where these paintings reside, which have not yet been analyzed. What is furthermore really interesting is that the art market often refers to these paintings to increase the prices of, increase the asking prices at auction. So in addition to understanding kind of our own histories and the materials in our collections, we are not walled off from commerce. And Yale is also, by sharing this information, I think it's really important to make sure that students who are studying these works understand that while they may appear to be in a very early style, maybe 13th century style, that they are in fact modern, so that in learning about this, they write their essays with that in mind, but also in sharing our access to technology and scientific findings with our region and collections, so that they can also learn these things about their collections, and so that museums and collectors choosing to acquire objects can be a little bit more tuned in to the potential of these objects being much younger. And I wanted to highlight that none of this work that we do takes place in vacuum, and so many folks who are conservators and art historians and funders and instrument manufacturers help us tell these stories. So we're really looking forward to continuing to working on the stories next door and sharing those with you and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bazar and Dr. Hark, and we're really excited for the demonstration after the break. Before then, we do have our second presentation in this segment from Anne Bancroft. Hopefully, just in terms of introductions, please assist me in welcoming Anne Bancroft again.
I might have to use yours. Ooh, Natalie, do you know what the Wi-Fi is in here? The same one that's up top. I'll try. Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry to keep you all waiting. I'll be with you shortly. doesn't have a prongy thing here. You know, the little prong. Unless I can, I don't want to climb up over the objects. And just see. But I think that has a prongy thing as well, so that's not going to work.
Can I just see, can I reach that?
I don't know if you can. It'll be, yeah.
No, I can't see. It's in.
Can you just measure the hand, the old style or the?
Try and get into the slide. It's like that. I'm a bit stuffed. If we can run that, I can do it. Yeah, I could do it. It's just the reaching up over the objects. That's a bit problematic. Could you help me with this? Moving this up? No, just shifting the slate case. Could you maybe just move this to the side, please? Can I grab that chair? Yeah. I do have working at height training.
Do you have this extension cord in there?
That might be a bit better, mightn't it? Does that work? Is that a funny one or is that a normal one?
It's an older one.
Yeah, good idea.
Or this one. This is newer.
Thanks. Thank you. Take a peek. Is it on? Yay, we have juice. Could you pass that? Thank you so much. There we go. Thank you so much for bearing with us. I'm going to just continue on from Anna Close and Richard's and Kendall's wonderful work about technical art history project, case study, because one of the many important things about conservation science is adding that layer of rigor to it. So being able to have the art history, the cultural context, the materiality of the object, it just brings into so much our understanding of something. And occasionally you do get a magnificent opportunity to make incredible discoveries for disassociated objects that weren't thought to be connected previously. So we can see that both in terms of the cards that Richard was talking about, as well as the paintings that Aniko just talked about. So I'm going to quickly run through this as part of a study of some sacred painted cloth that comes from Tibet. It's a Buddhist imagery which is sacred. And I was looking at these painted cloths, and some of them are full of color, and then others have a single ground background. And out of the single ground backgrounds are some raffle ones, which are protector deities, which technically shouldn't really be seen by anybody else, but after lots of wars, etc., and displacement, the objects also became displays. So this is the normal structure of an object, as well as it being authenticated for use by a particular practitioner, which you can see with these seed syllables here. I'll whiz through, but the context of the original use can basically inform on why we have particular damages to the object. So these ones, they were rolled cloth, so they were unrolled and then rolled back up and sometimes carried, and in other instances they were hung in temples. Yeah, and they were other times they were used as teaching aids to teach the laity. The monastics would teach the laity about the certain practices and belief systems. So I decided to investigate 3 of the nagtangs, meaning black painted cloth, black tankas, and stylistically they looked very similar. And to me they looked like a particular hand, but the iconography didn't actually make too much sense. Yeah, because being able to identify these particular deities, which of course we did know from before from the work of Dr. John Clark, who was a curator there, very much focusing on Buddhist material cultural heritage. You were able to identify the deities in the central deities, which form a mandala. So there's a whole set of iconometry involved in order for these particular objects to activate, to be used. So if you don't draw it right, they won't work. And if we look at aesthetics in Asian cultures, if the face of a deity is disfigured, then that's very disrespectful. So there's a lot more interventive work that can happen with some religious objects. So you can see here that the inner brocade is very similar. There's a cording that goes around. So I was really approaching this from a materiality viewpoint, thinking, okay, well, that's interesting. They're from the same period, which is a new Mendri style. So they painted in particular styles in particular centuries. But then I started to go through with trying to identify all of these different deities, but some of the paint was wearing off. Now, I was told by a Tibetologist that this makes no sense and they can't really be connected because you've got all these different teachers appearing here that come from different schools, meaning like how you have Anglicans and Catholics, it'd be like the Anglicans, the Protestants and the Catholics mixing together. And that doesn't really happen that often. And so there wasn't evidence there. So I tried to identify as much as I could, but my Tibetan leaves much to be desired. So that was problem going to root text. So I continued on with the fabrication, and you'll say, well, why is the conservator banging on about this? Well, I had to fix it. So I wanted to understand, and also wanted to look into the art history and the cultural use of these particular things. So the thing that I did was really looking at detailed shots, looking at the warp and the weft of the canvas to see, which is not really a canvas, it's a cloth that's got an open weave, and then lots of layers of ground are placed not only on the front, but also on the back. Yeah, and burnished burnished quite quickly. And then looking into the details into the painted structure. So what I end up noticing is that we've got text, we've got these patterns, and they're repeated across all three. Again, the iconography didn't particularly make complete sense, and why, which I'll go into a little bit later on, but I won't go into too much. So there was consistent script across the back in three different types of script in Tibetan, Lansa, Siddham, and Uchen, and Ume. And I had these translated, and they were, yeah, quite precise. Yeah, and again, the structure was the same, the pattern was the same, so I thought, well, this has got to be a set. Yeah, it's two, and it really is speaking to the fact that this should be made by probably the same artist, or at least in the same atelier. Some of the features of the secondary figures, they weren't very well executed, and that's kind of typical because normally the master in the atelier would be painting the central figures, and then you get a little chance when you're being the intern to do your painting on the maybe not less important but less emphasized figures. And the condition was really quite bad, but we did have preferential pigment loss on some of the areas, which pointed to, again, a similar use. This happened quite a bit. If something gets damaged, they just cut off a bit of it. And of course, in Victorian times, they were more interested in the painted element. You know, this textile brocade, what's that about? It's a beautiful painting. We're not really that interested in it. So they could have done the same thing, which is just framed it like a Western work of art, and they did do that. So the next thing that we did do was looking at it under ultraviolet, the visible, and the infrared. So this imaging was done by Dr. Giovanni Vere. So I worked with two different conservation scientists on this project, and being able to have that access. And you could see that the palette's really behaving quite similarly. And we use about 3 different technical analysis techniques that you've heard about to corroborate the pigments that were there. And what this meant and what it showed was that the same paint was used across all 3 paintings. So if somebody's telling me, no, it's not a pair, or I could at least say, well, sorry, it's not a grouping, then I could at least say, well, actually, it's got to be from the same atelier then, even if the iconography does not make sense. Yeah? All right. And then what was the other interesting thing it is in these manuals, it talks about the deities, and the deities who are Raffle, they're protectors. So you don't want somebody, you know, who's a bit airy-fairy protecting you. You want some big, muscly MMA fighter, you know, coming through to look after you. And these are what these guys, you know, do in terms of they use Raffle protection. And in those treatises, it says that, well, the manuals, it says that they're blue-black in color. So on the analysis, what we found, because you could just paint it black, right? But no, there was blue present there as well. So they stuck to that. The other thing that I found in some translated rare texts was that they also ground up the ashes with the paint of particular practitioners or devotees to this, to the different deities, so that they can be even more efficacious in use, which then turns them into reliquaries. Yeah? Also terribly fascinating, not much has been written on it. So after searching hundreds of images of tankas in collections all around the world, which is why it's so wonderful to have any museum objects and galleries to have their collections online. You can search through those and do search the collections, which is great. But I also had to go through old gallery catalogs, yeah, and some of them were black and white, and came across this one in black and white, and look, the treatment of the brocade is the same. Yeah, so if you're looking here, there's there, and look at this fantastic area. And so this is a dragon brocade, yeah? And this is a complete tanka, which is in Leiden. But again, this is another Mahakala, so why would you have 2 Mahakalas, this particular deity, within the same grouping? I wouldn't know, but I wouldn't know because I'm not from that particular Buddhist community. So this was all done because I was looking at New Mendry style and trying to find things. And then I found other ones where it looks as though it could be from the same atelier, but there were differences. Yeah, such as this one. And that had a different brocade as well that could have been replaced. Anyway, eventually happened upon this object in a museum catalogue from an exhibition, and this lovely text on the back, which is highly unusual to get this, actually says, this is Lama Boten Rinsendrup, who decided that he set up a whole monastery which looked at incorporated all the different 5 schools of Buddhism. Therefore, that's why you had images of teachers from different schools. Yeah, so they were all together, which is highly unusual. And then this was blessed, and it says that this is one of several. This is a centerpiece, and that there are other pieces, other deities within this collection. So this is multiple objects. Yeah, and it still has the blue on the top, and it has the full complete area. But up top, as well, gives you it unusually has the artist's name. And we can trace back his dates because he was incredibly famous, which is highly unusual, and you would never have that. So this ended up transpiring that we brought together, and conservation science and conservation and the art history of it brought together what was originally just 3 tankas, yeah, that looked like without a brocade, to realize now we know what the original brocade looks like, which you can probably track that down. So I'm in the midst of trying to track down that brocade, which of course comes from China. And then to seeing the back of this one, which does have the same script written down. So what was just going to be, oh, let's study the materials of this painting, ended up bringing together a group across Holland, the UK, and America. Yeah. Which was previously unknown, and because the Lama, whose name is inscribed on it, comes from this particular monastery, and you could see how the grouping would hang inside of a temple, but this would be in the inner temple, where only particular practitioners would be allowed, and as well as how we trace them back by going into the provenance files, which is why it's so important to keep the records of all of the provenance files. And a major American connection is here, an American athlete connection, because they decided that they were going to be quite interested in collecting these particular objects. So what I'm saying, for this particular study, we're just seeking permission for, now that we know that it's highly likely that this is part of a group, that we want the evidence, which we can get from scientific analysis. If the Leiden Museum and the American Museum will do the same analysis across their paintings, then we can definitively say, I think we can definitively say now, but after being told that, this is probably, not a group, it is good to have that rigor behind it. So this isn't about dating, but this is about bringing together something that was separated. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne, for sharing the important work that you do with us. I think it's really interesting for all here to see how it can be applied across different circumstances. We now have a brief window for questions before we break, so I'm going to ask the 3 speakers to come bring their chairs, if possible, up to the front. And I know that Jada has been waiting patiently to ask the questions, so I'm going to hand over to her first to get going. Yes, once they're sat down. Yeah, maybe Dr. Pissarro, you can bring yours over, and I'll give you guys the mic to share. Right, Judy, yeah, go ahead.
Well, ever so rarely when I was an art student, I would sometimes see an article where it would be like this great phenomenon that a piece was discovered under a piece, and it was painted over and then painted on top, or that a piece was heavily edited in such a manner that it took going through the entire chemical process to identify that there was some form of tampering. So given what
I think that there's always very exciting to discover that there's something below the surface. I think when you have a Van Gogh painting and you discover that there's another Van Gogh painting, how exciting! You only wish they were side by side. There's a lot of complexity, I think, in decision making about how do you present this to an audience. If you want to bring that forward in a museum exhibition, and I think if you're having to do any kind of treatment, then you also need to understand how this complexity and layering may be impacted by the steps you're taking to fill losses, compensate for color. It is complex when we need to interpret information. So we use the imaging techniques that Richard talked about and Kendall mentioned, radiography, infrared imaging to see below the surface. The X-ray fluorescence scanning can help visualize these changes that you mentioned. And then we've worked on projects where the artist has a very complex technique and there's a painting under a painting. So to interpret the different layers, we need to have a sense of the big picture of how do these layers that we see relate to the different themes that are shown. We have a painting at the art gallery at Yale that has a beautiful moonlit landscape on top, and underneath it there's a painting of the Virgin Mary, we think, with two cherubs on each side of her. And so it's kind of fascinating to find that. And to figure out which layers go with which image. So it makes it complicated, but we have good tools for it.
I'll just add something to that. While it's a kind of exciting to discover something that you wouldn't be able to see unless you had these tools, there's also other purposes for seeing this. You mentioned changes that the artist did. So just recently I was looking at a painting, and you could see that there were significant changes in the composition, position of a chair. This is late 18th century English artist. And the reason that was important there is because there's another version of the painting. And it's frequently a question of who has the first one, which collection has the kind of the original one. And so the one without the changes is usually the one that the artist did afterward, right? That he or she was trying to figure out how to get this right. And once they did, then they made a copy that doesn't have all the changes. So there's a lot of purposes in seeing these kinds of things. So it helps with dating, as well as Aniko mentioned, there's an economic component to these things. One might be worth more money because it's the original creation as opposed to a later copy.
Yeah, I have a question that kind of builds off of that. In a lot of old maps that I've seen, in which I guess kind of related, there are drawn, but there are intentional changes which reflects kind of a changing landscape. I think the one which comes to mind is the area around Roanoke. They made changes to hide potential places for star forts. How would you treat that in a conservation context?
Yes?
Repeat. Repeat.
I'm sorry.
Repeat that one, please.
There, in maps, sometimes there are intentional changes by the original artist. And I brought the example of the Roanoke area where they had places they wanted star forts to be, but then they intentionally covered that up to prevent the map from falling into Spanish hands. How would we treat that in a conservation context?
Thank you. I don't think the conservators would do too much to that. I think what we would, because if we go to conservation scientists, and then hopefully they can reveal that was there. But then, maybe you'd speak to the if there are any stakeholders around, but is there an ethical issue with revealing that? Is there a safety issue with being able to reveal that? So that I guess, yeah, I just probably leave it alone and get a really good image if I wasn't going to put anybody in danger. You know, if I were to go back in time or whatnot. Kendall?
I've got a very good. So when I was at the National Gallery, there was a painting. It was an unfinished painting on top of another unfinished painting. So the artist just could not make a decision and just didn't finish it. And then it got into the collection of. So it was like a 18th century Italian painting, and then it got into the collection of a very kind of famous 20th century English artist who decided to paint over it and finish what the artist had tried to do. So there was the ethical questions of, do we remove that because the artist that kind of tried to finish it is also famous, so his art was kind of worth a lot as well, along with the Italian artists that was underneath. So we decided to remove it because we can document what had happened very well, and then just let the Italian artists indecisive.
Yeah, quite right, Elizabeth. I think all a case-by-case basis, and that's a fantastic case study as well. But I guess the other thing that I would put this question over to the curators, because the conservators would be going to the curators saying, well, actually, you know, what is more significance? Because you can argue, if we like to debate, is all of historical integrity to the object. It's all part of its history. So what would the curators do?
We had this conversation already, Anne, with handwritten annotations on maps and the history behind that. So like pencil marks that may indicate a kind of note or a date or a price sometimes. And so it's like, how do you start to chart the parameters of what is considered historically important to the object? So I think it's no easy answer, right? It's a case-by-case thing. It's a debate. It's a lot of research. I think that comes up a lot in everyone's presentations. Everything starts from research and goes there. So yeah, I think that could. We are going to have a break, Jada, and a demonstration. I'm just going to ask if anyone else has a question, either here or online, and then you will have a chance for some one-on-one with all the speakers as well. So Elizabeth, do we have any questions? Online? Not online. Do we have any other questions in the room? No? Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. This regards the example that Anne had displayed. Given the venerated status of the item as a religious item, how likely, or have you encountered any examples of forgery of religious items in your tenure? And how often do you encounter forgeries of religious items?
I haven't personally encountered them, so maybe other people have, but I have heard that there's quite a lot of shards of the cross that Jesus was nailed onto. And I don't know whether that's an additional miracle where they have just multiplied, but maybe, and that's the only one I can think of. But I haven't personally come across that myself. What about in amongst all of y'all's years of experience?
I haven't personally encountered a particular religious forgery, but I think that the question of forgery and authentication is a really interesting one, and we all sort of play a role in it, the archival research and the scientific research. because there's a difference between something that's confused for something else, like the example of the Chinese wall paintings. There was every reason for someone who was just looking with their eyes and studying things to say, it seems to make sense. But in this case, the science was able to say the materials don't match. Of course, what if they had matched? It could have still been from the 19th century, but they just used materials that were appropriate for another time. So it's a really complex issue, but a very interesting one. We don't get asked a lot to say, is this genuine or not genuine? No.
Just to add to the conversation, what came to mind with Monica's presentation was the configuration of public vision in terms of our practice. And then that kind of, the concept of forgery, but then the concept of learning how persons went about creating art piece and creating that practice. So there's a interesting complexity that Yeah, I think that, as scientists, we can find the materials, we can understand how they may have been changed, where they are, but when we talk about forgery and changes, really the questions we're interested in are intentions, right? And so that is a bigger leap to make. We can say, this has materials in it that mean that the whole object couldn't have been made prior to this date. But, that's kind of where we leave off, and then the story continues to explore and asking questions about, there's a particular, there are many historical movements where we are trying to recapture the appearance of an earlier time, where that time and those depictions are so important for us. So there are many reasons why things that are made now may look and made in traditional ways. And so I think the intentions and the place in the culture, that's not often, the scientific questions sort of leave off, and then we're always, we all obviously have our opinions and interests ourselves as scientists, but I think it's important to kind of open the conversation back up again and learn about the history and be in partnership with other thinkers and scholars to stay curious and tell that story together or work on that story together. So I appreciate both of your questions about that aspect.
Okay, what I'd like to suggest now is that we take a break and convene in the Cunard at 4:15. For those who are not aware where the Cunard or not familiar, when you go out into the lower courtyard, look to your right towards the upper courtyard, and you'll see the sign for the Cunard Gallery there up the steps, okay? And there's some refreshments to the back of the room as well.